Salute e salve e benvenuti ad una nuova puntata di Storia d'Italia Extra. Prima di iniziare vorrei informarvi che il 25 giugno alle 19 sarò a Piola Libri qui a Bruxelles, quindi cari amici belgi in ascolto, drizzate le orecchie. Ripeto, alle 19 del 25 giugno a Piola Libri per presentare ovviamente Quando Venezia distrusse l'impero romano. Come ci sarà Claudio Vernarelli, storico, ma anche uno dei rappresentanti italiani nel Comites, e il mio ex presidente dell'associazione degli abruzzesi a Bruxelles, che si chiama A Bruxelles. Ottimo nome. Vedrete che ci divertiremo, spero che sarete dei nostri. In un certo senso oggi chiudiamo in bellezza la storia di Liutprando su un altro canale. Questo perché, come sempre, per me il podcast Storia d'Italia deve restare sempre solamente in italiano. Quindi quando ho anche un'intervista interessante per il podcast, ma in inglese, per me deve andare per forza su Storia d'Italia Extra. Il professore Christopher Heath mi ha fatto un'enorme gentilezza, questo perché in realtà lui è l'autore della prima monografia dedicata a Liutprando che io sappia pubblicata in qualunque lingua, italiano, inglese, tedesco, francese, you name it. Quindi è stato un grande onore avere la possibilità di leggere in anticipo il suo libro. Io gli ho scritto mesi e mesi fa, proprio perché avevo trovato, non mi ricordo dove, la notizia che stava per uscire il suo libro su Liutprando. Quindi appunto l'ho contattato per sapere se sarebbe stato possibile leggerlo in anticipo e così è stato. Ho potuto ricevere il PDF del libro e appunto leggerlo in anticipo rispetto all'uscita del libro. In anticipo anche rispetto alla maggior parte, penso, dei colleghi del professor Heath. In generale l'ho trovato una sintesi necessaria e inspiegabilmente mai prima realizzata appunto del regno di Liutprando, di tutte le fonti che abbiamo a disposizione a riguardo di questo re, e ha anche influenzato in molti versi il modo in cui io ho compreso questo re. Ci tenevo quindi veramente moltissimo ad intervistare il professor Heath per avere il suo parere sul regno di Liutprando e sulla sua importanza anche a livello europeo, della storia europea successiva. Ecco quindi che è nata questa intervista che spero vi piacerà, vi consiglio assolutamente di ascoltarla. È in inglese, come detto, ma un inglese facile da seguire. Ma banda alle ciance, vi lascio alla nostra chiacchierata. It's such a pleasure to have you today with me. I have been wanting to interview for a long time, and thank you so much for being here, but also for being so kind to send to me in advance the book The Age of Liutprand, even before it was published, I believe. So so thank you so very much. Before we start, I would like to. I would have said already in the introduction, but I would really suggest anyone that is interested in Liutprand to go grab Professor Heath book, The Age of Liutprand. It's a really good book. Professor, yeah.
I was going to say, grabbing it might be quite expensive, but I do expect that there will be a paperback edition sometime in the future.
Oh, okay. I hope so too. Unfortunately, yes. The academic books, I know very well, can be expensive, but yes, it's a lot of work behind as well. The first question I have for you is why nobody wrote, as far as I know, in living memory wrote a biography about Liutprando? Is it what is the reason in your opinion, and eventually what brought you to it?
Okay, well, that's a very good question to start us off. Walter Kegi, who wrote a work about the Emperor Heraclius, pointed out that
great, yes,
the fact that there isn't a one-volume treatment by an academic about any given individual in the past doesn't necessarily mean that there should be one.
yes.
But for me, it was always a curiosity that there wasn't a treatment of Liutprand in a sort of concise and precise way. It was a mystery to me, and this was one. If I can take you back, there's something called the International Medieval Congress, which is held in Leeds every year, and I encountered Ian Wood one dinner time there, and he was looking for contributions to his series on the early Middle Ages, and I'd sort of like spent some idle moments whilst I was doing my PhD thinking about, well, wouldn't it be good to do a monograph on Liutprand? So I blurted out to him, well, I could write you a book about Liutprand, and he was quite enthusiastic about it, inviting me to do a book proposal. Now, how did I find my way to Liutprand? Now that's also a very interesting question, and I suppose the answer to that is that around about 2013 I completed a PhD on Paul the Deacon, and in Paul I concluded at the end of that for Paul the Deacon, Liutprand was the epitome of effective kingship in Italy, and in particular Lombard kingship in Italy. So in a way, my old friend Paul the Deacon led me on to Liutprand. So to go back to your first question, which is why hadn't there been a one-volume treatment? That is a mystery. It's not one of those situations. If you think about Thomas Hodgkin, who wrote Italy and Her Invaders, he had originally not Thomas Hodgkin, William Dudley Fulk, who was the translator of the English translation of the Historia Langobardorum. He had originally thought he was going to write a history of Venice, but he was so overwhelmed by the detail that he gave up the idea and decided to just translate the Historia Langobardorum. Now, this is not one of those situations. I don't think there is so much material on Liutprand in either an Italian context or in a general European context that it's an impossible endeavour to write a one-volume treatment on him. So it's not a question of there's too much material. It's not really, even in a way, I think, thinking about historiography of Lombard history in Italy and beyond, that there is so much debate and so much controversy that somebody would feel awkward, about starting a volume. So it is a little bit of a mystery. I mean, we mentioned briefly, didn't we, the maestro of Italian Lombard history, Stefano Gaspari's one volume on Desiderio. So he could very easily, in my opinion, have turned his thoughts to Liutprand in a one-volume history. So I don't know, I may have waffled on a little bit without coming to a set view about it. I mean, as you all know, there is a multi-volumed and detailed edition about Liutprand coming out at some point in the future, edited by Archetti. But even so, I've seen one or two chapters. Again, there isn't so much material that it isn't possible to write the book.
Yeah, it's interesting for me because, for example, I just bought this Spes Italiae, which is a book on Pippin of Italy. That as a king of Italy is important, obviously, but his entire life is under Charlemagne, but there is a volume, at least a collection. This is not a monography, but it's still a collection of essays about Pippin. But your book is the first that really tackles Liutprand, and it's interesting. But, sometimes like that something like that happens. I notice also from the Byzantine point of view, there's a lot of Byzantine emperors that do not have, and that are relevant. Of course, the point is relevant and without a biography. So Liutprand, I gave it for assumed, let's say, that is relevant. So he's an important king, of course, for the entire first half of almost the entire first half of the 8th century, and not having a biography seemed strange to me. So I'm glad I mean, biography is probably not the right word, but
No.
you know, like
Well, I mean, it's interesting.
It's a book treating the character and his
right.
age.
Interestingly, as I listen to you carefully, I can't recollect a comparable work on Otho, King of the Mercians, for instance, who was very broadly speaking, from the 8th century. So it does happen. I mean, it could be that historians and commentators are dealing with matters that aren't controversial. So because they aren't controversial and there's not very much to say,
there's not too interesting.
Or so they think there's not very much to
or
say.
so they think, because I found a lot of and we will get into it, a lot of points in your book which really resonated with me, so I'll get to it. Okay. The most important being this sort of precursor to Carolingian times.
Yes.
So we will get that. That was really a point that I also got, you know, without saying, but I got to that point, you know, by just reading myself, and then I read your book and said, yeah, indeed, I completely agree. But we'll get to that. The title of the book is, and this is really the point, you know, is really Age of Liutprand. So do you think, as a king, Liutprand defined that age, so the first half of the 8th century in Italy and beyond? Do I ask, you know, did I understand in that sense the title as you put it?
Well, can I thank you for your questions are very helpful and acute. There are two things to say. The first, the easiest answer is yes. Yes.
But there's also no.
Well, my PhD supervisor was Paul Foraker, and Paul Foraker wrote a work called The Age of Charles Martel.
Yes, okay. Indeed. Oh, I read that too. Okay, yes. Fantastic.
So it is a sort of hidden tribute to Paul Foraker.
Yeah, it's a tribute. Yeah, I understand.
But there is something that Paul has often said in public, which is that there was a tendency, certainly in England and maybe across the narrow sea in what is now France, that when you talk about European history, you're actually just talking about Frankish history.
Yeah. Sorry, I got the quotation of George R.R. Martin, so I chuckled a little bit. Yes, sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So English historians had a tendency, I don't think it's current now, that when they talked about Europe and they made extrapolations from European history, they would just go across the narrow sea. Find the
just
answer.
Francia.
Yeah, just Francia.
Just Francia.
And actually, the treatment of Liutprand in Anglophone scholarship is a perfect example of that. Because actually, so far as significance is concerned for kingship in the 8th century, it is the age of Liutprand. Liutprand is the, if you like, the model for subsequent effective kingship in early medieval Europe, including Charlemagne. Now, I'm not obviously suggesting that anybody whispered in the ear of Charlemagne that this is how effective kingship works. Just follow the model of Liutprand. Although, actually, thinking about it, this might be a bit naughty.
Well, Paul the Deacon was there. Paul may have said a few.
Paul the Deacon was there, and Paul the Deacon emphasises his closeness to Charlemagne on a number of occasions. That, you know, it's not impossible that the model could have been discussed in his hearing. But more seriously, I think, yes, so far as Italy is concerned, you can make a case for saying that the early 8th century was the age of Liutprand, because he had a multi-generational impact. And that's demonstrated, I think, most clearly by the references that you see in the laws of Ratkiss. Ratkiss, who terms Liutprand his, quote, nutritor, his guardian, his guidance, which I think is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And Rakis that really put an end to, in a way, to his dynasty, in a way. So it was from another family. So this is not a connection, a familiar blood connection. It's just an ideal connection.
Exactly, it's a connection of clientship, I think. And even if Aistulf, his brother, who supplants Rakis in 749, even Aistulf's actions demonstrate a sort of following through of what Liutprando was trying to do in the 730s.
Mm-hmm. Clear. So another question is now in the terms of sources, right? So of course your beloved Paul the Deacon is one of the major literary source for the time of Liutprand. So is the Liber Pontificalis. I wanted to know, and this is usually, these two sources are what they are usually used to make a narrative history of this time. However, what is the role of documents and laws from the time of Liutprand? So the Codice Diplomatico Longobardo and the laws to let's say, how do they integrate the picture of the narrative sources?
Well, let's have a think about where we'd start with that. The sequence of charters, so far as Lombard Italy is concerned, really starts to gather pace from the, if you're generous, from the early 8th century. There isn't very much before Liutprand. I think there's one or two maybe dubious charters from the time of Königbert. So charter materials aren't extensive, but they do exist. There is, of course, the infamous, I call it infamous, Siena Arezzo imbroglio.
Yes.
Which in a way, I think is extremely fascinating.
Yes.
And it's one of those things that everybody quotes from it, because of course you have the famous, I think I have it in the book, the famous reference where the Gastald, the local Gastald in it's either Siena or Arezzo, forgive me, I'm not sure which, leans on a witness to say, make sure you say nothing to the king's missus who's coming to sort this out. Make sure you say nothing. Keep quiet.
So, because they are listening. It just gives an idea of this. I got an idea from that as a much more effective control of the territory than I could normally envisage for a high, medieval kingdom. Of course, it's not a modern state, but it gives an idea of a machinery that anyway it's trying to control the territory.
Right. Oh, absolutely. I mean, maybe we're going off the point slightly, but what you can see certainly in the Lombard laws, and this is really important, because if you spend some time reading carefully the normative Lombard laws of Liutprand, you get a very strong sense that here is a king trying to set out an effective governance, an effective structure. I call it a capillary structure of governance, where he is involved indirectly in how Lombard elites and networks control their areas. Now, he's obviously not able to be everywhere all at once, and in fact, evidence for his mobility is relatively limited, to narrative sources and notices in the Liber Pontificalis. But you do get a sense that that people know that he's keeping an eye out on them. The Notitia de Actoribus Regis, for instance, is where he sets out very clearly what he expects his officials to do and what his officials should tell him in the local areas. So to go back to your original question, you can flesh out and you can determine and discuss a lot of these normative materials that give you a real strong, for me at least, give you a real strong sense that here is a king that's trying to set an ordered, hierarchical and effective governance strategy for his kingdom generally.
Yeah. And the impression that I got, because people are actually going to him at the end, to ask for judgment. So they consider that power not to be a fig leaf, not to be ineffective, at least. So they think that if that power residing in Pavia can actually make decision and it's not useless. And maybe this is a bit an Italian point of view. Let me explain. Sometimes we have because our modern state is not so efficient. So a lot of people even today would be in a way deterred from using justice, for example, because they think that it's never gonna work anyways. So, and of course, I'm not trying to suggest that it was more effective in the 8th century than today, but just to explain how that surprised me in that sense.
Well, I wouldn't say that's necessarily only an Italian impulse, but I would say that there is a very illustrative example that Paul the Deacon sets out, which is how Liutprand deals with Pemo of Friuli. And very briefly, this is a situation where Pemo had fallen out with Calixtus, the Patriarch of Aquileia. Now, we are told by Paul the Deacon that Calixtus was fed up with living with what he termed rustics in the ruins of Aquileia, and he was jealous of Amator, the bishop who was resident in Cividale di Friuli, and he wanted to take up residence in the bishop's house there, which is what he did. This offended Pemo, whose first impulse was that he was going to throw Calixtus out of a castle into the sea. Much to now, Liutprand must have found out about this. We're not told how, but he basically told Pemo he was out of order, and he decided that he was going to replace Pemo with his son Ratkiss. So we go back to the Neutral point. But previous kings of the Lombards had a sort of, I don't know how you'd characterise it, but a sort of on-off relationship with the dukes in Friuli.
Yeah, in Friuli,
and sometimes they were able to impose their wishes in the area, but sometimes they weren't. And I suspect that what you get with Paul the Deacon is a sort of peritactic chronicle of Friuli. But you do get a sense that actually the dukes in Friuli are able to do more on their own, or they have a greater autonomy than sometimes is suggested in the literature. So the point of this anecdote is that in the end, Pemo is called for judgment before Liutprand. And Liutprand is able to enforce his will. In other words, that Pemo is removed from power and Ratkiss replaces him. Now, there is some argy-bargy, if you use the English phrase, and the entourage of Pemo flees to the church of San Michele in Pavia. But the important thing here is that Liutprand is able to enforce his will in the locality of the kingdom. This is some considerable distance from Pavia, as I'm sure you know, but maybe the listeners don't.
Yeah, no, they know. Yes, Friuli is for any Italians far away.
Well, I mean, I can tell you as I did, because I undertook a pilgrimage to Cividale di Friuli from Venice. It is some distance and a surprising train change at Udine.
Yes.
But it was worth it.
I took the exact same train. So small little train from Udine to Cividale,
exactly.
ending at Cividale. Here ends the line.
I mean, there was panic for me and my companion at the time because we didn't realise that it was a separate train company. You had to get a different ticket.
Yeah.
But you can imagine, for me, being able to sit in Piazza Paolo Diocono, it was.
It's a lovely place in general, no? Cividale. It's so seldomly visited, and I will actually, for your information, I will take a group of my listeners there. So I organized a tour of northeastern Italy. So we do Ravenna, Comacchio, Venice, Aquileia, Cividale, and then so I'll try to bring a few people to Cividale. So you wrote that in a way, Liutprand, as you said at the beginning of the interview, is like the quintessential king of the Lombards for Paul the Deacon. By the way, at a time where Franks had kings, but they were not effective because they weren't ruling until 751 when the Carolingians became kings, and the kingship is defined as being the kingship and king is defined by four. You identified four elements. So making laws, managing the military, religious patronage, and the management of peace and war. So of these four elements, how successful was Liutprand in in each one, like all four of them, which one he was more successful or less successful, I guess. But in a way, I liked that four structure. So it's a way of talking in chapters about Liutprand that I find it useful.
Okay, well, you might need to prompt me as we go along, of course, to make sure I get.
I'll make sure that I'll remind you that all four of them.
Well, let's start with the management war first. War first of all. It's not because I'm a great fan of war, but it's certainly a component of kingship in the early Middle Ages that is, quintessential. It's vitally important that kings are successful in war. Now, our friend Paul the Deacon points out that Liutprand was always successful in war. Now, broadly speaking, the answer to that is yes, he was, but we are bound by our sources. The one occasion, I think, where we can say that there wasn't success was with the recapture of Bologna and the misfortunes that his nephew Hildebrand encountered when the city was recaptured by the Ravennans on the behalf of the Eastern Roman Empire in the late 730s. And there is an anecdote in the Historia Langobardorum which is supposed to be read with regards to Arrakis and Aistulf and their bravery, because they formed the rear guard.
Yes, it's a little battle
in a forest.
In the Marche region, yes, in a forest.
Exactly. So that is not really a success.
A lot.
No.
Yeah. No.
Now, the other thing that should be mentioned, I think, at this stage is Liutprand's intervention into Francia on behalf of Charles Martel and the Islamic incursion, shall we call it, for want of a better term. Now, in actual fact, we are told that Liutprand did not fight the Islamic armies. And in fact, his appearance was enough to put off those that were in control of Narbonne. So whilst Paul the Deacon makes a point of pointing this out, that he'd gone there to help Charles Martel, there is no evidence that there was any military action. So those are the two, you might say, the two negative elements of his military reputation. But on the other hand, there is distinct evidence that he successfully nibbles away at the Exarchate of Ravenna, to the extent that really it is just left as a sort of a little area around the city proper alone. He creates a new dukedom in Persichetta, and installs a duke there. So he cuts that, if you like, umbilical cord that used
between
to run,
Ravenna, between Ravenna and Rome,
through Perugia to Rome. He cuts that, and he certainly puts the Duchy of Rome under pressure. And as you will know from a close reading of both the Historia Langobardorum and the Liber Pontificalis, there are cities in I suppose you'd call it now modern northern Lazio, which are taken under Liutprand's control. So I think in military terms, yes, his reputation is fair. He is effective in war. I think that's what Paul the Deacon approves of.
But to prompt you, as you asked me to do, you said war and peace. So management of war and peace. And I just want to know, in your opinion, because all this war is kind of, I intend it as a sort of continuous negotiation, with the popes and with the exarchs, and there's always this dance of alliances between dukes, exarch, popes, and the king, what is your opinion about his calculated use of force? Because he seems to be very use force in a very calculated matter. So only when when he thinks he has the upper hand, and only to reach an agreement in that sense. Am I reading correctly?
You are. Now, what I would say is, thank you for bringing that point up, because he has a reputation as an opportunist. You will often see, I think, again, English historians suggesting that really he's only really good because he knows, a little bit like the Hungarians in the just before the Second World War, steal a bit of territory or acquire a bit of territory just when your opponents are at their lowest ebb. I don't read it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I would deduce evidence for, again, it comes from Paul the Deacon, but there is objective evidence to support it. Paul the Deacon says that he kept the peace with the Avars, he kept the peace with the Bavarians, and he kept the peace with the Franks. So there's three components there. Now, if he doesn't keep peace with those three entities, that doesn't give him a free hand to do what he wanted to do against the Exarchate of Ravenna and Rome, and indeed for his ambitious policy with regards to Spoleto and Benevento. So if you think about the Bavarians, that he wasn't at peace with the Bavarians all the time. Earlier on in his tenure as king, he acquires and pushes up the Lombard frontier to the north of, I think, modern Miran, whereas before it had been further south. Now, some commentators will see that this was done in concert with Charles Martel, and that again it was somehow opportunistic. I think that there is an intelligence behind this which suggests that he can see that activity is going to be beneficial to the kingdom's
of the Franks also.
Exactly.
No, so I also got the impression that it's more like a way of connecting with Charles Martel, this growing power north of the Alps, because he seemed across his entire kingdom to really want to keep Charles Martel on his side, so that he doesn't have a problem, as you pointed out before, in Italy. So he has a really diplomatic, I would say modern diplomatic way of approaching this. I need to do enough things so that Charles Martel also helping with the wars against the Arabs, which wasn't a concern for him yet.
No. I have to say, it's really frustrating that there isn't sufficient evidence from the Frankish side to be able to demonstrate that sort of relationship between Liutprando and Charles Martel. There's almost like a damnatio memoriae in Frankish sources about Liutprando's activities. I think I go in the book to try and find something in Frankish sources that will help us, readers, commentators, to actually form an idea of what's going on. Certainly, we have the letter from Pope Gregory, Gregory's right, Gregory II. Well, it might be, no, I think it's Gregory III.
I think it's, I think anyway, no one is sure, absolutely, but I think it's Gregory the Third.
But we're seeking assistance from the Franks against the Lombards, and we don't get the response, but the answer is obviously no, I'm not going to intervene. I think that for me is a very important relationship, because it does permit, on a broader scale, Liutprando to undertake activities in the Italian peninsula without the fear of intervention from the north.
And I'll get to the other three elements. I haven't forgotten.
Oh,
but
yes.
I have
Good.
I have one sub questions on that, and I get the impression that by virtue of this good relationship with Charles Martel, I mean, Pippin is made, there's Paul the Deacon says, so I should say that Pippin is kind of adopted by Liutprando.
Yeah.
But virtue of that, he has an incredible opportunity in a way to act in Italy without Frankish intervention. And Bavarians and Avars, that's another subject. Do you think he spoiled that opportunity? Because several times he comes close to taking Ravenna, comes close to imposing his will on Rome, and every time he seems to pull back, to reach a diplomatic. Was it at the end too diplomatic? Being more aggressive could have served him better?
Yeah, now that's a very good counterfactual question as to what it was that, there he was at the gates of Rome on a number of occasions, and in fact in Rome on one occasion, as we know, because he visited the shrine of St. Peter. And yet, in a way, he doesn't sort of dot the I's and cross the T's and take over Roman control. I have to say that you get the impression that, confronted with essentially the moral power of the Pope, that he was not able to bring himself to turn the Pope into essentially a subjugated metropolitan within the Lombard kingdom. I think that was always the problem for the Lombard kingdom. He was never able to square that circle. For whatever, you cannot really term the Pope as simply a sort of rather more important bishop. That's never going to work. It didn't really work, I have to say, in my opinion, although my reading of Ostrogothic history is not great. It didn't really work under the times Theodoric the Great. There was an attempt by Theodoric to turn the popes into just essentially,
a bishop of the Gothic kingdom,
yes,
basically.
Yeah. I have to say that would have been really difficult. Later on, no doubt you will discuss Desiderius, who attempts the same sort of thing with varying degrees of significance. Now, why do I come to that thinking? Well, because of course Liutprando refers to the Pope in his laws as the leader of the Western Church. So that entanglement, in a way, between the religious authority of the Pope and the increasing political authority of the Pope, caused by the religious formant known as the iconoclastic controversy, is one I think where he fears to tread. So I don't know. Do you think I've answered that question?
I think you did answer the question. It's a very fascinating, and I did break one rule: never ask an historian what would have happened in another case.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that he had occupied Rome. I'm not so sure that there would have been at that point a Frankish intervention.
It's possible.
So, but it's impossible to say at the end of the day.
Or even a Roman intervention. He may have been even scared that one day the Byzantines, of course, I'm talking about Byzantines. These two powers were still lingering just beyond the horizon, and something very provocative like occupying Rome, it's a big deal for everyone and can draw in foreign powers.
I would say, in conclusion, I would say that actually I don't think his aims were to occupy Rome, or indeed really the Duchy of
Rome, right?
I think like Aistulf subsequently, he would have been content with occupying the strip that ran up to the Exarchate of Ravenna and inculcating Ravenna into a hegemonic Lombard kingdom, which tightened control over Spoleto and Benevento. That for me is the key, because the ability to move down and across to Spoleto and Benevento was circumscribed by the Byzantine territories in the central peninsula.
And in a way, if you want, that's what Charlemagne at the end did. He occupied Italy, but he basically brought a kind of an hegemonic power on Rome, but never occupied Rome itself, and have always treated Rome as kind of an equal ally of the Frankish kingdom, and it seems to me that probably was the goal also for Liutprand, to have like the Duchy of Rome as the power of the Pope, but then himself, as you said, hegemonic on the rest of Italy, and acting as a protector of St. Peter from that point of view. But that didn't pass at the end.
No,
and what about sorry.
No, I was just going to say that there are limits to the hegemonic ambitions of Liutprand, and I think the interesting thing is that he reached them anyway with regards to Benevento and Spoleto.
Yeah, and it seems very clear that was much dearer to him than conquering Ravenna or Rome. Like, it was very important to him that the Lombards were united in that sense.
Yes.
Yeah. What about then we have I think we covered the military and peace and war. What about laws and religious patronage then?
Well, out of the three, I think really his contribution is his legal contribution is the most important. He adds, I think, 153 titles to the 388 of the Edictum Notar. And these are, for me, I never tire of saying it, a fascinating window on 8th century life, Now, of course, this is a view of how the world should be. It's not necessarily a view of how the world really was. And this is where, the issue with the charters and the Placita would be really important. If we have more of those, that could give a window on things. But I think you've already mentioned there are some very highly specific titles in that book. So it's very evident not. But what has happened is that a problem has bubbled up and found its way to Pavia. And you can imagine in the palace in Pavia, conversations, well, we've had this report from a local count. They don't know what to do. The law doesn't help. What are we going to do? And certainly over the majority of his rule, although the last 9 years there aren't any new sets of titles, you get the impression that there is an ongoing and effective engagement with law and with an effort to create and craft, if you like, a moral regime, but also one that deals with contingent difficulties. I mean, some of them are fabulous in their specificity. There's
I know.
There's the one about the woman that has her clothes stolen while she's bathing in a river, and what should happen, when she decides to go home because she has to walk home naked. Perhaps rather more appropriately, there's lots of comment about situation which arises with regards to female banditti. That's a collection of violent women that have been manipulated by men to beat up their opponents. Now, of course, in Rothari's edictum, there is a comment about, well, women don't undertake violence. It would be ridiculous to think that they do. And Liutprand is scandalised by the reports he's had that there are groups of violent women beating up men. That this is not something that women should do. Is the comment in the law code. But what's so rich about this is that this is real life. This is 8th century life in the raw going on, and a king is trying to put order or provide solutions to the situations. So for me, I think his legal contribution is the most fascinating, and this is something I intend to analyse and discuss in greater detail in my future work, because I think Thomas Gobbett is the prime scholar on the manuscript tradition of Lombard law, but I think he would let me say that there is sufficient bandwidth for me to sort of muscle in and discuss Lombard law as well. So the way I would link your law with the religious economy and approaches of Liutprand, first of all, is his approach in the prologues. Now, these prologues, again, are obviously programmatic intent to the law, but they are fascinating indication of how Liutprand perceives his own authority and how he entwines that authority into a Christian expression. So he defines himself as Orthodox, he defines the Lombards as Catholic, and beyond the prologues in the laws, you have a sense that he's also interested in religious questions. So there's one set of amendments later on, I think about the 24th, 25th year of his reign, where he tackles those that do not denounce witches, and he also tackles those who would dare to change their religion. But on the ground, there are some tangible things that he does. So first of all, there's the creation of the rural suburban manor at Corteolona, where he creates the very famous inscription, where he compares himself, favourably, of course, to the Byzantine Emperor Leo III.
Yeah, and by the way, I didn't know about this until reading your book. So I confess my sin. So I read it and I said, and light went on. Then I found a paper about this because, like, there is you know that there is a whole controversy around iconoclasm, and was Leo III iconoclastic, an iconoclastic emperor, yes or no? And Haldon and Brubaker saying no, others say yes. And then I realized, here there is a proof that at least in the West, at the same time, so the time of Liutprand, they thought that he was. So I thought this is like a piece of evidence, very important piece of evidence about iconoclasm that I don't know that went into that discussion too much.
Yeah, I mean,
maybe because it's from outside the empire.
Well, yes. I mean, the thing about the Western responses to Leo's policies, of course, there is some lack of sophistication in the responses to Leo's policies,
Mm.
and some would say that actually it's entirely misconstrued. But the
Yeah,
other,
they didn't
yeah,
understand what
yeah,
he was trying to do, basically.
exactly. But there is a sort of bread and butter issue as well with regards to Leo, and that's his fiscal policy,
Yeah.
which was opposed in Italy. Um, and it's interesting that obviously, so far as Liutprand is concerned, he is promoting himself as an orthodox king, and Leo the
Ah,
Third as
yes.
schismatic. But he doesn't mention
Yes.
the fiscal element. So you
Yeah,
might
but
be might be a bit cynical
it's
about that.
it's all propaganda. No, it's you're saying,
Exactly.
look, I am the better version. Like I don't tax you like Leo does, and I am Orthodox. So why don't you look at me
Yes.
as your natural king?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the thing is, at a very sort of basic level, of course, that's his perspective, and it's important that he has that perspective, and it's reasonable enough to persuade people at the time that he is. There is a distinction, an important distinction, to be made between him and the Byzantine Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, and of course there are. I mean, Nicholas Everett is always very acute about these issues. You can also hoover up a number of inscriptions elsewhere in the kingdom which promote a sort of Orthodox Catholic expression of kingship. Whether this is a program or not, I think that's the difficult view.
Yeah.
But if you combine it with everything else, then you get a very strong sense that Liutprand has not necessarily appropriated, but grasped the idea that his kingship is an Orthodox one.
Yeah.
And therefore, you can set aside perhaps the tradition that Lombard kingship the mixed tradition that Lombard kingship had in the 7th century in particular.
Yeah,
Which is another issue.
Another issue, and the point of view from the papacy that this was not a friendly kingdom, right? So it's trying to position it as a friendly Orthodox kingdom to a pope that is fighting with the emperor at that point of time.
Yes, I mean we also have that other straw in the wind, the restoration of the Cottian Alpine patrimony to the papacy, both by Adalbert II. It's interesting that Paul the Deacon mentions that Pope Gregory II has to remind Liutprand that he should renew that donation. It's quite interesting.
So it may have not been carried out entirely from the time of Adalbert.
Yeah.
In culture, in art, nowadays it has become common to talk about the Liutprand Renaissance, let's say, of the early 8th century, at least in Italy. We have enough, not so much, but enough art surviving from the time, and it is interesting that it's really a good. It's a sophisticated level of art. Whoever goes to Cividale and sees some of these, or Pavia, they're very beautiful. And I don't know how much has been lost, because usually these churches, they were rebuilt then in early, in the late Middle Ages. So probably we lost a lot of what was built originally.
Absolutely. Even in Pavia in the 18th century, the attrition rate of churches is quite considerable.
Yeah. A lot was lost. So we have lots of fragments. However, they paint a picture of a flowering of art. So how much do you think, and here we're going towards the conclusion, how much do you think this anticipates or even is conductive of the so-called Carolingian Renaissance of the late 8th century? So is there a connection between the two?
Well, there absolutely is a connection, but in terms of form, and here I'm thinking about the wonderful funerary grave slabs of Kuningpert and his daughter, but also the Abbot Cumian of Bobbio, and I think the grave slab is still on. You can see it at the museum in Bobbio even to this day. But the Cumian's funerary grave slab was actually paid for by Liutprando. So he's referenced in the inscription on it. Those wonderful forms. I mean, certainly if you go to the museum in Pavia, there's absolutely wonderful sculpture there. I always remember this wonderful peacock, for instance.
Yeah, the peacock, the Plutei. Yes,
really,
yes,
really
very
beautiful.
beautiful.
That beautiful work, that beautiful tangible work. I have to say, I don't recollect examples in Francia. So the connection between the Liutprandian Renaissance and the Carolingian Renaissance, I think, is more of an intellectual one. And there you can bring in the scholars that ended up, Mary Garrison calls them the collected scholars of Charlemagne, who were all Italian with a little I. I think that is the connection. The intellectual footprint of the Liutprandian court, of course, is a little bit shadowy, but it is definitely there. You have the activities of Thomas the Deacon, you have Peter of Pavia, you have the teacher of Paul the Deacon, who he calls Flavian. There is definitely a grammatical interest that is brought out very effectively and recently by a contribution I read, which details that sort of thread that runs through Lombard culture. And that interest in making sure that things are grammatically correct runs through into the Carolingian interest in the Carolingian Renaissance. And I think that's where the intellectual interests of the Carolingian court are linked very closely with the 8th century in Lombard Italy.
In a way, the conquest, if I understand correctly, the conquest of Charlemagne brought those bubbling trends that were in Italy. They brought them to the attention of a wider audience now, imperial scale audience.
Yes.
In all Francia, and of course, it's not the only thread. There is also the one coming from Bede and England, right? Very through Alcuin, etc. So there's not only one thread that goes of intellectual pursuit, but the Italian one is very important.
Yes, and I think the Italian thread is the one which sets out to make sure that everything is correct. So you have Paul the Deacon's interest in creating the homiliary. So we're creating a set of texts that is correct and congruent with canon and ecclesiastical law and history. And that runs through some of the other contributions as well. And the Italians, of course, are the perfect people to do that because they have never lost, unlike the Franks, they've never lost their contact with book culture throughout the early Middle Ages.
Yeah, clear. And in a way, this ends up, if we talk about linguistically, this ends up separating then Latin from the Vulgar, because the Carolingians gets fixated on using proper Latin. So Latin doesn't evolve anymore, and that leads to the language spoken and language written diverging even further between each other. Well, this leads me to my last question. Is very similar to the previous one, and we already alluded to at the beginning of the interview. So, to what extent then this this model of kingship influenced then the Carolingians in the model of kingship of the 4 points that we discussed: so war, military, war, peace, laws, and religious patronage. Both overtly and maybe unconsciously.
Yes, I think overtly would be quite difficult to demonstrate. And here I'm thinking about what would really be fascinating, and I have to say I don't think I've come across any work on it. It is whether or not the Carolingian sub-reguli of Italy actually take up a Lombard tradition. So I'm thinking here of Pippin of Italy, for instance, but also Bernard of Italy. And then moving on to Lothar I, Louis II, whether or not there is any direct pertinence between them. Spes Italiae, of course, the book edited by Francesco Borri, will help you out with Pippin of Italy. But of course, his age mitigates against an idea that he's taken up subconsciously or self-consciously, rather, a model of Liutprandine kingship. Certainly, he doesn't keep the peace with the Avars, because of course he invades the Avar Khaganate and destroys it. I think we did allude to it previously. I think you can make a case that there is a soft adoption of the approaches that Liutprando adopts in Francia more broadly. But these are traditions of kingship that have flowed from earlier in the early medieval period. So they aren't necessarily unique to Lombard Italy. Certainly an interest in protecting the weak and the unpowerful that flows directly from Lombard law into Carolingian capitularies.
Into Carolingian, because
absolutely.
the capitularies start to appear, at least they are conserved, and when they start appearing, to me they really, the objectives in a different form.
Yes.
So we're talking about the laws of the Carolingians. They seem to have, as you alluded to, those objectives to defend the weak, of course the free weaks, against the power of the powerful, of the counts, of the officials of the kingdom, and that appears when they start appearing when the kingdom of Italy is no more. So that's not a causality or connection, but it is interesting.
I think there is a qualitative difference between Lombard law and Carolingian capitularies, in the sense that you certainly get the sense with Lombard law that they're reluctant to tiptoe into the world of ecclesiastical moral religious law. I'm not saying that they avoid it completely, but the Carolingian capitularies are very happy to live in that zone where they will deal with things that, strictly speaking, in modern terms, we talk about religion and we talk about secular matters. So there is a difference there. Certainly not a difference so far as progressing War and Peace is concerned. There's obviously a direct connection with that. So I think there is a good case to be said that there is an effective link.
Okay, yeah. Well, Professor, thank you so very much for your time, and thank you for the work that you have done on Liutprando, on this, not forgotten but not as well known by the general public king of Italy. Thank you so much for your time again, and it was really a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much, Marco. Thank you for the invitation. It's always a delight to talk about Lombard kings.
Yeah. No, there's and laws and little diplomas, and I really look forward, by the way, the work on the laws, because I can tell you, and this just out of curiosity, there's a lot of Italian law scholars, not a lot, but some, that wrote in Italian about Lombard laws, but they are not historians. So I think they often miss the point about the history. They just get lost into the like lawyers or scholars of law will do, in the mechanics of the law.
Yes.
So it would be very interesting to have a historian tackling that. I mean, of course, the work of Gaspario, and let me see, because I have it here, Gasparri and Azzara, that they have all the laws collected. There's a little bit of commentary, but I think something more in depth will be useful.
Well, I'll tell you what, give me a couple of years and then we can have another chat.
Another chat about that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your work, Professor.
My pleasure. Cheerio.
Cheerio. E questo è quanto. Vi ricordo l'appuntamento di settimana prossima qui a Bruxelles e vi rimando tra un mese ad una nuova puntata di Storia d'Italia Extra. A proposito, questa sarà sull'Uzbekistan, ma c'è una diretta esattamente questo giovedì se volete ascoltarla in anticipo. Ci vediamo giovedì sera alle 21. Non mancate!